Good afternoon. Welcome to the Moravian Archives. My name is Paul Peucker. I'm the archivist, and I'm so glad that you are here. And I would also like to welcome all the people who are watching us online. We have quite a few people who signed up to watch online. We will have a recording available about a week or 2 weeks from now. We will add subtitles so that it's easier to follow. And you will be able to find the recording on our website. Afterwards, as you are used to at the archives, we have refreshments. They're over in the gallery. You can see our exhibit, and there are refreshments available there, and you can stay. The talk that we are going to present is also going to be available in published form in the Journal of Moravian History. The next issue that comes out in December will have the extensive version of our talk. And if you're interested in receiving a copy, ask Emma and she can sign you up so that once the issue comes out, you will receive it. We will send it to your home. And for the people who are watching, you will receive an email with a link where you can order a copy of this issue. Now it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Christina Petterson, my co-speaker today. Christina Petterson is a Danish-Australian scholar, and she has published extensively about the Moravians. Her most recent work came out just a few months ago, Early Capitalism in Colonial Missions, compares Moravian missions in Greenland, Bethlehem, and St. Thomas, and we can recommend this to you. Christina was here as a scholar in residence last summer, and during that time, we decided to do research on Anton Ulrich together, and that has resulted in this presentation this afternoon and in the article that will come out in the Journal of Moravian History. So in the story of Moravian missions, Anton Ulrich is well known. We know him as the Afro-Caribbean man who gave the original impetus to Moravian mission work. After his encounter with Count Zinzendorf in Copenhagen in June of 1731, Anton traveled to Herrnhut and gave the members of the community a first-hand account of the situation of the enslaved in the Danish colony of St. Thomas and their desire to hear the gospel. And as a result, two men, Leonhard Dober and David Nitschmann, traveled to St. Thomas the following year. Their missionary efforts stand at the beginning of Moravian mission work. Countless times, this story has been told in scholarly books, pious tracts, Sunday school classes, and even in a video. And one of the actresses from the video is here with us today, or maybe even more. But as well known as Anton Ulrich's name may be, very little is known about him from the older historiography, beyond the facts immediately surrounding his travel to Herrnhut. What do we know about his birth, his circumstances before he traveled to Herrnhut, his marriage, his relationship with the Moravians, nor about his life after he returned from Herrnhut? Anton's character remains flat. In traditional Moravian historiography, Anton's role is that of a helper, while others appear as the true heroes. After giving a moving account of life on St. Thomas, Anton quickly disappears from the stage. His 15 minutes of fame are restricted to his role in Copenhagen and Herrnhut in 1731. In our presentation today, we would like to piece together Anton's biography. We would like to find out who he was and his relationship with the Moravians.
The research we are presenting today began to take shape here in Bethlehem last autumn, as Paul said, when we found a letter from Count Ferdinand Anton Ulrich to Zinzendorf from 1735 among David Nitschmann's papers. Oh, right? No. I practiced. Oh. Okay. There we go. We will return to this letter later, but here point out that it was a response by Laurvig, Anton Ulrich's master, to a request by Zinzendorf regarding Ulrich. Now, the traditional historical narrative sees a break between Anton Ulrich and the Moravians in 1734, which made this letter from 1735 unusual. And so naturally, our interest was piqued. One thing led to another, and we got hold of several letters from Herrnhut between Zinzendorf and Laurvig. We found baptismal entries, diary entries, and finally, after we had finished and submitted the article, the most astonishing thing happened. Olaf Nippe from the archives in Herrnhut sent me a text with a picture of a document which turned out to be an autobiographical statement made by Ulrich himself.
Oh, wow.
Paul had been hoping that we would find something like this, and I thought, no chance. But I was so happy to be proven wrong. So these new archival sources are what we want to present here today. And I have to say that last summer and autumn, we were just running back and forth. It was like, look what I found, look what I found. I found this time. It was a constant movement. It was really exciting. Anyway, after a brief presentation of the historiography, we will present the biographical pieces in chronological order. The account of Anton Ulrich's visit to Herrnhut first appeared in print in several different Moravian publications around the same time. That's the second half of the 18th century. David Kranz's History of Greenland and his History of the Moravian Church. It appeared in Spangenberg's biography of Zinzendorf, and of course the abridged version of Christian Georg Oldendorf's History of the Moravian Mission in the Caribbean. Although they differ in the amount of detail provided, their accounts are all similar. They describe 1. Zinzendorf's encounter with Anton Ulrich in Copenhagen in June of 1731. Here Ulrich tells Zinzendorf about the desire for the enslaved, and particularly his sister on St. Thomas, to hear the gospel. 2. Zinzendorf's report to the congregation 2 days after his return to Herrnhut on 21st of July, 1731. 3. How Zinzendorf's message inspired Leonhard Dober and Tobias Leopold to go to St. Thomas. And 4. How Anton Ulrich, shortly after his own arrival in Herrnhut on the 29th of July, reaffirmed Dober's and Leopold's determination, albeit cautioning them that it was nearly impossible to get in contact with the enslaved unless one was willing to become enslaved himself. So in most Moravian publications, Ulrich's part in Moravian history ends with his speech to the congregation in Herrnhut. His departure from Herrnhut is not mentioned, nor is much presented about the rest of his life. The original manuscript of Oldendorf's mission history, however, contains much more information on Anton Ulrich. Because the original manuscript proved too long for publication, Johann Jakob Bossart was charged with editing the manuscript, which resulted in a heavily abridged version that omitted a lot of stuff, including most of the details of Ulrich's later life. And it was not until the year 2000 that Oldendorf's complete manuscript was published as a scholarly edition. That way or that way? No, I said there. So that's the published manuscript of the 2000 complete manuscript, and just for the sake of comparison, this is Bossart's abridged, edited version. So you can see, that's quite a difference in size. So this publication here led, among other things, to renewed attention to Anton Ulrich in scholarly literature, especially in the valuable work of Louise Sebro and Catherine Gerbner. Because Oldendorf, however, has his own agenda, one of our focus points has been to verify his account in the surviving archival records. Some events we have not been able to verify, and others appear in a very different light, and we'll touch upon these during the talk. All right, so early life. We'll begin with the information in the autobiographical statement, namely what Ulrich related about his life while he was in Halle in Germany in 1731, covering the period from his time in St. Thomas until just after his departure from Herrnhut. From this document, we learn that Anton Ulrich himself secured his passage to Copenhagen by writing to Laurvig, requesting to become a Christian, and paying a sailor to ensure delivery of the letter. Ulrich, who was then known by the name of Jack Abraham, left his wife and children and traveled to Copenhagen. Here he received instruction in Christianity, which led to his baptism. He then resolved to bring his family to Copenhagen from St. Thomas, but his wife was attacked by dizziness, fell overboard and drowned, and this he only discovered when he showed up to meet her when the ship arrived in port. Persuaded by Laurvig to marry again, Anton traveled back to St. Thomas to acquire a wife, and sought out a woman, quote, who I knew led a quiet life and had a good disposition, and who I hoped would also accept the Lord Jesus, end quote. She agreed to marry him, but her owner would not let her go at the price Anton could offer. So Anton had to return without her, but sent his request along with the sum of money he had, which was 300 thaler. Initially, it was refused, but a year later, the fiancée, whose name is Gratia, or Grace, turned up in Copenhagen, and Anton left her to be instructed in Christianity while he traveled to Herrnhut with Zinzendorf. Some elements from this document corroborate the traditional Moravian narrative, such as Ulrich's great religious desire. He had, as he allegedly told the Moravians, often stood at the shore in St. Thomas and sighed, "Oh, that I would only get to know God." Later Moravian narratives mention his desire to understand the contradiction between Christian teaching and Christian behavior, and this is a quote from Zinzendorf's, one of Zinzendorf's texts, quote, that this unknown God would give him the light to understand what the Christians spoke about, but did not act accordingly, end quote. Ulrich's narrative also confirms the information that he received good knowledge of Christianity in Copenhagen, resulting in his baptism. Other elements contradict the information we find in Oldendorf. For example, according to Ulrich's words, he traveled to Copenhagen alone, and when later his wife was on her way to join him, she fell overboard, as I just mentioned. Oldendorf relates that Ulrich's resistant wife threw herself overboard on their joint travel to Copenhagen, and so, while suicide by drowning was not an unusual form of resistance by the enslaved, Ulrich's own narrative seems to contradict this interpretation. We do also not gain any information as to Anton Ulrich's actual status. The fact that he had the means to pay a sailor to take a note, presumably written by himself, to Laurvig, travels back and forth from Copenhagen to St. Thomas several times, and is able to lay down 300 thaler for his future wife, is an astonishing degree of freedom if he is, as has been assumed, enslaved. We also do not hear anything about his employment in Copenhagen. From other sources, we know he was employed as a valet to the Crown Equerry. I've already mentioned him a couple of times, Count Laurvig. As we have seen, this position also afforded him some freedom, such as travel, and some of the correspondence we have uncovered will shed a bit of light on this. But first, we turn to his baptismal record, which the baptism took place in 1727, a year earlier than what Ulrich recalls in his account.
So on February 26, 1727, Abra, as he was called back then, was baptized in Copenhagen. The fact that he was baptized was known before both Krantz and Oldendorf mentioned this. What we did not know were the date and the location of the baptism until our recent discovery of the baptismal record in the Riksarkivet in Copenhagen. The entry contains previously unknown information about his former names, his parents, his age, as well as the names of the officiating minister and the names of the sponsors, who were all distinguished members of Copenhagen society. The entry from the church record states, number 8, 26th of February, Jack Abra, a heathen from St. Thomas, son of Abra and Lisette, was baptized at the age of his 45th year by Professor Königsmann. He was called Anton Ulrich, and his godparents were Countess Laurich, Countess Blume, Madame von Ahnen, and Miss Klippingen. His godfathers were the Count of Laurich, the Count of Danneskjold, Count Ulrich of Ahlefeld, Chamberlain Reventlow, Captain Rumor, Mayor Beauregard, and Councillor Schupp. The baptism that took place at the Citadel Church in Copenhagen in 1727 was performed by Andreas Ludwig Königsmann. At his baptism, Jack Abram received the names Anton Ulrich. It is not unlikely to assume that he was named after his master and mistress, Ferdinand Anton von Laurwich, and his wife Ulrika Eleonora, or perhaps he was named after Ulrich von Ahlefeld, another one of the male sponsors. As relatively short as the baptismal entry may be, it is very informative. We learn his former name, the names of his parents, and Anton's approximate age.
In 1731, when Ulrich was about 48 years old, he encountered a group of Moravians in Copenhagen. According to Oldendorf, Ulrich opened his heart, especially to David Nitschmann, and told him about the situation among the enslaved in St. Thomas and about his sister who, quote, prayed to God to send someone to instruct her in Christianity. The idea that Ulrich's biological sister yearned to hear about God but had neither time nor opportunity fired up Zinzendorf's heart, and immediately he wanted to send Nitschmann to St. Thomas, but this idea proved impractical. Instead, another plan developed. Anton Ulrich was to visit Herrnhut. How this plan came about is not completely clear, but it seems connected with the desire of Ulrich's master, Count Laurwig, and his wife to visit Herrnhut. Zinzendorf wrote to the is that the one? Yes, I think so. Yeah, sorry. Zinzendorf wrote to the elders in Herrnhut, yesterday, Count Laurwig, grandson of King Frederick III and the king's equerry, spoke with me very heartily about his inner feelings for several hours. He and his wife, Queen Anna Sophia's physical sister, who like him is touched by God, both certainly want to visit Herrnhut. He sends his favorite, the black man Anton from America, a tender soul, along with me to have a look at Herrnhut and to prepare the way for the conversion of the blacks in Africa and America. While this suggests that the visit was instigated at Laurwig's initiative and permission, another letter seems to suggest Anton's visit was indeed Zinzendorf's initiative. On Monday the 4th, Count Laurwig came to me to speak about his black servant, whom I want to take with me. Sorry, that was a quote and it ended there. The purpose of Anton's journey was twofold. One, for Anton to get to know Herrnhut and perhaps to inform his master and other pious people in Copenhagen, and two, to prepare the way for mission work. Zinzendorf had been preparing the Herrnhut community to get engaged in overseas evangelization since 1728. The presence and first-hand account of someone who had recently converted to Christianity himself were to aid the realization of Zinzendorf's plans. Anton Ulrich himself only mentions that he left his fiancée in Copenhagen and traveled with Zinzendorf to Herrnhut. Indeed, Zinzendorf hints that the unexpected arrival of Anton's bride from St. Thomas on the 21st of June almost obstructed the plans. Ulrich nevertheless took on this task with pleasure and went on his journey. On 28th of June, Ulrich, together with David Nitschmann, left Copenhagen to Hamburg, traveling in a chaise.
Anton Ulrich's journey from Copenhagen to Herrnhut took a little over a month. On Sunday, July 29th, 8 days after Zinzendorf, Anton arrived in Herrnhut, where he stayed for a month. And the day before his departure from Herrnhut, on August 29th, Anton addressed the Herrnhut congregation. This was the address that reaffirmed Dober and Leupold in their desire to become missionaries in St. Thomas. The Herrnhut diary only mentions the fact that Anton spoke to the congregation. More details about the content of Anton's address are given by Oldendorp. Anton spoke about the desire of his sister and other Blacks on St. Thomas to get to know God and that they would convert to Christ if only someone was there to tell them. He emphasized the, quote, abominable, heathenish, and sinful state, unquote, in which they lived and how miserable and harsh their physical conditions were. He told them the enslaved would hardly have any time or opportunity to learn anything, especially since their owners would oppose it, as the whites thought them despicable and did not want to have anything to do with them. Therefore, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for the white missionaries to get in contact with the enslaved. The only possibility Anton saw was, quote, to go among them and to become like them, a slave, in order to interact with them and to instruct them, end of quote. The next day, Anton, together with his travel companions, left for Denmark. Anton Ulrich arrived back in Copenhagen on the 29th of September, 1731. His return trip had taken him through Halle, where his life's story was written down. Upon return, he wrote a letter to Zinzendorf in which he thanked for a gift Zinzendorf had given him for Gracia, his fiancée, a small booklet of presumably edifying words to memorize. As mentioned earlier, Anton Ulrich's first wife drowned on the trip from St. Thomas to Copenhagen. Sometime before 1731, Anton went to St. Thomas to find a second wife. As he told the people in Halle, he was not able to take her with him upon his return. And while his original offer had been refused, Gracia nevertheless arrived in Copenhagen on the 21st of June, 1731, a week before his departure for Herrnhut. On December 12, 1731, Anton's fiancée was baptized in the church belonging to the royal castle. And the entry reads, Anno 1731, the 12th of December, a Morris was baptized by Mr. Bloom and was named Charlotte Dorothea. Male sponsors were Count Laurich, Count Danneskjold, Chamberlain Hackstusen, female sponsors Countess Laurich, Countess Bloom, Privy Councilloress Harbo, and Baroness Sövendal. A letter from Laurich to Zinzendorf explains that the name Charlotte and Dorothea were after Countess Blume and Countess von Zinzendorf. Following her baptism, Anton and Charlotte Dorothea were married on March 6, 1732, in the same prominent church where she was baptized, and by the same minister, court chaplain Johannes Bartholomeus Blume. The baptism and the marriage of this exotic couple in the chapel of the royal court could not have gone unnoticed among members of the highest circles in Copenhagen.
Anton Ulrich initially showed great sympathy towards the Moravians, although over time his attitude appeared to have changed completely. Indeed, after his return to St. Thomas, he seems to have rejected them. But in 1732, when the two first missionaries on their way to St. Thomas arrived in Copenhagen a year after Ulrich's visit to Herrnhut, Nitschmann and Dober did not lose much time before visiting him. In their initial letter back to the congregation in Herrnhut, they write that they visited Anton Ulrich on 16th of September 1732, the day after their arrival. Although the other servants at Laurvi's court, presumably, had given him a hard time, Ulrich had remained steadfast in his faith, and the missionaries were pleased with him. His wife, Charlotte Dorothea, they note, quote, has a good disposition. She seeks the dear Savior very seriously. According to her knowledge, she only lacks proper guidance, end quote. In Moravian parlance, this is high praise and shows the appropriate desire and indicating that she was receptive to the workings of the Savior. During the following days, they met with him again, and the last act before setting sail was a cordial prayer with Ulrich, who gave them a letter for his sister and his brother. And this is all sort of well known and printed in a book that contains the documents from the beginning of the Moravian mission, published by Rüdiger Kröger in 2006. So his master, Count Laurvig, on the other hand, had changed his mind. It seemed, his master, Count Laurvig, on the other hand, had changed his mind, it seems, and now sought to disentangle himself from the Moravian West Indian project. The exact nature of Laurvig's change of heart remains unclear. When Dober and Nitschmann met him on 20th of September, Laurvig said, quote, "It would not be possible. He did not want to be involved with the matter anymore. He had distanced himself from it," end quote. But then at the same time, Laurvig appeared delightful to them. And before departure, they made sure that they said goodbye to each other. Since Zinzendorf's visit in the previous year, public opinion in Copenhagen regarding the Moravians was changing, as most recently described by Juliane Engelhardt. And it is possible that this had influenced Laurvig. Another possibility is that Laurvig's objections concerned a different matter, Dober's and Nitschmann's plan to sell themselves into slavery in order to get closer to the enslaved. In a later letter to the Countess of Stolberg-Wernigerode from 1740, Leonhard Dober mentions that Anton Ulrich had, when they met him in Copenhagen, changed his mind in regard to the idea of the missionaries selling themselves into slavery. Quote, "In this, the Moor had already changed his mind again when we arrived, and for this reason also Count Laurvig regarded it as impractical to go there," end quote. And although the idea allegedly came from Anton Ulrich himself, he no longer thought it practical, as many others in Copenhagen considered the plan completely unrealistic. And it also was really difficult for the missionaries to get passage to St. Thomas, which also sort of corroborates that particular narrative. The Lord Chamberlain, Karl Adolf von Plessen, for example, said to David Nitschmann that this plan to self-enslave, quote, "the whites would never allow," end quote. Quite possibly, both Laurvig and Plessen were concerned that the Moravian plan would cause unrest on St. Thomas, with loss of revenue to its stake and shareholders, which included most of the Danish aristocracy. Undoubtedly, the religious turmoil in Copenhagen in the years 1732 to 1734 is an important backdrop to the relationship between Ulrich and the Moravians, especially as Zinzendorf was gradually becoming an unwelcome guest in the capital. But during their visit, there did not seem to be any change of heart in Anton's behavior. This is presented only in Dober's later letter. Did something perhaps happen in the almost 10 years between Nitschmann and Dober's visit in Copenhagen and Dober's letter to the Countess of Stolberg-Wernigerode that could explain this change? Leading question. I think it's me. That's okay. On 13th of February 1735, Zinzendorf made a proposal to Laurvig. He asked whether Anton Ulrich and his wife could be permanently left to the Moravians. "He is getting older and older," Zinzendorf wrote, "and perhaps now is the time that Ulrich, who must have been 53 years old by then, could become a promoter of the land." This is from the letter. So Zinzendorf writes, "These days I have been delighted with the arrival of the dear elder of our congregation," that's Leonhard Dober, "and of little Carmel. I cannot conceal from your excellence that I long for the dear Anton and his wife, and it would be a great mercy to me if your excellency would leave him to me under your conditions. He is getting older and older and could become an instrument of God. His sister's conversion, which is the first since our brothers arrived in Thomas, is important to us all. May I ask your excellency to let him know about this? I do not want to confuse anyone in their service to me, therefore I rather address myself to your excellency and let Anton know nothing about it. I assume, however, that they will both be pleased if the former table servant becomes a promoter of the lamb and a wedding inviter on the streets of Grace." Only a few days before Zinzendorf's letter on the 5th of February 1735, Leonhard Dober had returned to Herrnhut together with Ole Carmel, a 7-year-old boy from Loango in Africa, whom Dober had purchased in St. Thomas before his return to Europe. Zinzendorf's proposal to Laurvig to send Anton as a missionary to St. Thomas must have been connected to a conversation Dober had had with Anton Ulrich while passing through Copenhagen. Apparently there, he had expressed his desire to take his wife to Herrnhut and become useful to the Savior. Laurvig discussed the matter with Ulrich and Charlotte Dorothea and responded to Zinzendorf that they were both too weak to make the journey to Herrnhut and would rather remain in Copenhagen. This is a quote from the letter from Laurvig to Zinzendorf. What I have said to my black man Anton and his wife about the gracious consideration which your excellence has for them, in order to hear their thoughts as to whether they would be inclined to dispose of themselves in Herrnhut and to remain there permanently. However, since both of them are a very weak constitution, but especially the wife often suffers dangerous accidents and sometimes has to be bedridden for many weeks, it would seem that they feel little inclination for such a journey and have particularly agreed to end their lives in this place according to the highest will. And this is, by the way, the letter that we found in Bethlehem that started the whole thing. Zinzendorf was clearly not pleased with this response and sent a stern letter to Ulrich in which he expressed his confusion about Ulrich's apparent change of mind to come to Herrnhut and ultimately St. Thomas, and his disappointment about Anton Ulrich's refusal to accept God's call. Zinzendorf relates how Ulrich had told Leonhard Dober that he was, quote, eager to be of use to his Savior in the world, end quote, that he wanted to return to Herrnhut so that Charlotte Dorothea may, quote, receive a deeper impression of grace and a greater light, end quote. Zinzendorf had thought, he writes, that following the Moravian mission to St. Thomas for Ulrich's sister's sake, and given the fact that Ulrich himself, quote, was also the first whom the Lord put a desire into his heart to win his people and his own when he was walking along the shore in West India, end quote, Zinzendorf had imagined that Ulrich would be compelled to work as a missionary to the slaves. Zinzendorf explained that he was following the correct procedure in asking Laurvig first because Anton Ulrich was his servant, and Zinzendorf did not want to act against the 10th commandment, i.e. coveting another man's possessions. Zinzendorf dismisses the above-mentioned explanation of Charlotte Dorothea's health and compares it to the life and death of salvation. However, he continues, if our dear Anton and his wife are otherwise not willing to sacrifice themselves to the Lord and his service, but want to bury their pound, especially his, in a napkin, then of course we are not helped by them, and it is better that they both go for nothing, like so many people who owe their strength to nature and have to pay. May the Lord do as he pleases. Finally, Zinzendorf pointedly asked why Ulrich had said one thing to Dober and Nitschmann and something else to Laurvig. So clearly, Zinzendorf had expected Anton Ulrich to be quite willing to come to Herrnhut and had already made plans for Ulrich to become a missionary to his own people, and was very affronted by his behavior and decision to remain in Denmark rather than to join the work of the Moravian cause. It is also very interesting that Zinzendorf should feel the need to defend the fact that he had asked Laurvig first instead of Anton Ulrich himself. Zinzendorf's reference to the 10th commandment indicates that he saw Ulrich as Laurvig's possession, and Anton Ulrich may well have taken exception to this suggestion. In spite of the expressed wish to spend his later years in Denmark, Ulrich did return to St. Thomas several years later.
The Moravian diary of St. Thomas mentions Anton Ulrich's return as a free man to St. Thomas, but does not give much detail about when that happened. Many years ago in Copenhagen, he was set free and sent over here. Oldendorf does not give the year either, but he is a bit more specific about Anton's circumstances. The miserable circumstances of the black man Anton, who had first given rise to the work of God among black people, affected Leonhard and all brothers very much. After a while, he came back to St. Thomas, was free, took up a post as master servant here and there, and had afterwards his own small plantation between Tappus and Krumbe, where he managed well with his wife and his slave woman. He was, according to Leonhard, too weak to withstand the force of the sin which reigned there and to remain faithful to his discernment. In all of this, he was very much self-righteous. He had been led astray in Copenhagen regarding the brethren, and he would not let them bring him back to the way of sinners, to be recognized as ungodly and made righteous. He finally came to a sorrowful end and helped himself to it. His slave girl, who had been also his concubine, had been converted, was still alive when I was there, and had been baptized and among the free women. This paragraph seems to summarize what the Moravians knew about Anton's last years. He arrived back in St. Thomas, became a master servant, ran a plantation with his wife and a slave woman, and came to a sorrowful end. The exact date of Anton Ulrich's return to St. Thomas has not been widely known, but Christina made a chance discovery in a book on the Danish West Indies Company. In a list of commodities on the ship St. Andreas of the West India Company sailing to St. Thomas in February of 1741, the author notes that the ship also carried a single passenger, namely a man with the name Anton Ulrich, and his modest belongings. Anton then returned to St. Thomas in 1741 on the company ship St. Andreas. The reasons for Anton's departure from Copenhagen are unknown. His passage was paid for by Jacob Schönemann, deputy governor in St. Thomas, and not, as one might expect, by Laurich. The transport included his own person as well as his belongings. The Black Anton Ulrich bringing along, according to specified, one trunk, one box, one suitcase, one small cupboard, one packing barrel with bed linen, a half dozen of chairs, a little basket with small stuff. After having spent some time being caught in ice outside of Copenhagen, the ship arrived in St. Thomas on the 22nd of June 1741, with Anton, his belongings and furniture. Anton Ulrich did not, however, bring his wife. As she was in bad health already in 1735, we assume she had died by that time. At the time of his return to St. Thomas, Ulrich was about 58 years old. He did not have much contact with the Moravian missionaries on the island, but they were aware of his presence, as is clear from what Oldendorf tells us. Anton first took up a post as master servant. This means he worked as an overseer or slave driver on one of the plantations. He shows up in the West India Company's accounting books from St. Thomas in 1742, where he is listed as overseer of the slaves and as a creditor owed 8 Danish thaler. He is mentioned again in 1743, where he is listed as a debtor to the company for the same amount. Later, Anton Ulrich had his own small plantation located between Tappes, or Charlotte Amalie as it's called now, and Krumbe, a small peninsula west of Charlotte Amalie, close to the airport.
So it would have been around here, somewhere in that area. Yeah.
For those of you who know St. Thomas or yet to know St. Thomas. And he lived here with his wife and an enslaved woman. Furthermore, in Anton's tax declaration to the authorities from March 6, 1755, he is listed as a widower. Does this mean that his second wife did not die, as we assumed earlier, and returned independently? Or does it mean that he married for a third time? Anton also reported to the Danish tax authorities that he owed one capable black woman and a 2-year-old girl, possibly his daughter. In the tax list from 1755 to 1758, we find her name, Diana. who is listed with one child and who by then was free. Oldendorp tells us that Diana had been Anton's concubine for a while. Diana was still alive when Oldendorp visited the island in 1767. By then, she had been baptized, and perhaps the free woman named Diana mentioned in the minutes of the Helpers' Conference from January 28, 1762, as a baptismal candidate is this Diana. And if that's the case, she was baptized either Maria or Amalia on January 31st, 1762. Two women were baptized that day, so we cannot say exactly what name Diana got. Oldendorp provides a few comments regarding Anton Ulrich's relationship with the Moravians during these years. He notes that when Anton was deadly ill in 1745, he begged forgiveness from the Moravians. Quote, "As willing as one was to do so, one felt little fruit from his repentance after his recovery." End of quote. An entry from the diary around the time of his death may shed further light on his relationship with the Moravians. Moravians had high standards for conversion. They demanded a true change of heart, and they did not exclude the possibility of someone's relapse. A believer, therefore, had to constantly question the state of their faith. Anton apparently did not understand the Moravians questioning the depth of his faith. Did not the fact that he had counts and countesses as sponsors at his baptism prove he was a good Christian? On the contrary, the Moravians considered Anton a superficial Christian who did not want to know about the Savior. From what the Moravians recorded about Anton Ulrich, his last years were not happy. The diary calls his last years an unnatural, bad life. A later entry calls his conduct ungodly and adds that he had killed many blacks. If true, Anton may have committed these killings while he was a slave driver, or perhaps he was a bounty hunter for runaway slaves. At the same time, the diary entries suggest he was severely troubled and tormented by his behavior. On February 20th, 1756, Anton hanged himself in the bush not far from his cottage. Diana, who had gone looking for him, found him. And the next day, Anton Ulrich was buried on his property. At the time of his death, he was about 73 years old. The diary does not say if the Moravian missionaries were involved with the burial. On the other hand, in a typical Moravian fashion, the diary looked back on his life and recalled the instrumental role he had played in 1731 for the beginning of their work on the island. This is from the diary. We also heard today a sad example of poor Anthony Ulrich, a black who made the first opportunity for the first mission to St. Thomas in the year 1731, when he came in his count's service from Copenhagen to visit the congregation in Herrnhut, and told that his biological sister here in St. Thomas would like to hear about God. He was set free many years ago in Copenhagen and sent over here, but has unfortunately led an unnatural, bad life, although he has held himself for one of the best Christians, in that he had only noble godparents at his baptism in Denmark. So he hung himself yesterday in the bush, not far from his cottage, without anyone knowing any need, as his black woman says, who searched for him and found him. He was buried today near his cottage. May God comfort him, for he did not want to know anything about the Savior. At the time of his death, his sister Anna and his brother Abraham were still alive. We come to the end. Anton Ulrich plays a near mythological role in Moravian historiography, but we only hear part of the story, the trip to Herrnhut and the beginning of the mission. In the end, however, Anton, who is credited as the person who instigated Moravian missions, rejected the work. Still, his name is frequently associated with Moravian overseas activity. We found when Anton Ulrich was born, the name of his parents, the former name, that it was his own idea to go to Denmark to learn more about Christianity, that he traveled back to St. Thomas to find a second wife, and that his second wife arrived in Copenhagen just days before he himself left for Herrnhut. We found that he told his life story in other places besides Herrnhut, and the version he gave in Halle on his return journey to Copenhagen was even written down. We found that Zinzendorf wanted him to become a missionary, and that he refused. And we found that he returned to St. Thomas in 1741, where he became an enslaver, had a third wife, Diana, who eventually joined the Moravians. With our research, we have demonstrated that it has been possible to find a significant amount of biographical information concerning Anton Ulrich, which may be unusual for many common people in early modern times, enslaved or free. Because of his association with the Moravians and with high society in Denmark, Anton left a stronger trail in the archival record. In that respect, his life was unusual. What we were unable to find was his legal status. When did he become free? We do not know if he was manumitted upon his baptism in 1727, or if this happened when he returned to St. Thomas in 1741. There is also discussion if anyone who lived in Denmark could be legally enslaved, as slavery officially did not exist in Denmark. Another question we were unable to answer is why he severed the connection with the Moravians. Severed, yes. Oldendorp hints that Anton was won over by the anti-Moravian sentiment in Copenhagen. Catherine Gertner argues that the break was a slow and gradual one, and not just due to the external pressure from his peers and his master, but also that Moravian missionaries may have contributed by their critical and judgmental mindset towards converts. The correspondence we have uncovered offers yet another possibility. Perhaps Anton Ulrich did not like how Zinzendorf pressured him to become a missionary. Instead of asking Anton himself whether he wanted to come to Herrnhut and become a missionary, Zinzendorf wrote Count Ulrich, thus treating Anton as a slave subject to a master. This heavy-handed approach may have offended Anton and made him feel unrecognized and disregarded. In the end, we do not know. Although we have been able to uncover many facts about Anton Ulrich's biography, his own thoughts and opinions remain elusive. Thank you so much. Do you have any questions? Please.
Good day.
Do we know what kind of profession or kind of work he did before he left to go to Copenhagen? You know, if he was a master of slaves later, was he already working in that same kind of condition, or was he basically an individual slave on the plantation?
We got the impression that he was an enslaved laborer on a plantation owned by the Danish West Indies Company.
And that's because his brother and sister were enslaved on that plantation. So we assume that he also, and he was born there, I think, as well.
Then how did he get all that money?
Yeah.
He had a lot of money. I mean, way more than I think most slaves are going to get in several lifetimes, I would think.
Yes. Well, we know of money that he had to send a letter to Copenhagen.
Right.
That was a couple of shillings.
Right.
Later, he had $300
Yeah.
to purchase his wife. That's when he was living in Copenhagen.
Right. That's
So-
a lot of money.
Perhaps he was given it by Laurvig or yeah.
But how did he get there? He had to, I mean, he had to pay to get to Copenhagen. didn't he?
Presumably, yeah. And the trip back to St. Thomas as well
Right.
would also have cost a pretty penny.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of.
Yeah.
There's a lot of unknowns there
Yeah.
about someone who's a slave who could, and how could he leave if he's a slave?
Yeah.
Slaves just aren't allowed to just get up and go. I wouldn't think.
In the account that he gave in Halle, he talks about that it was his idea to leave, and then someone said, how can you leave? Do you really want to go to Copenhagen? And we thought first, oh, this is maybe someone who says, you're enslaved, you cannot leave. But it was not about that. It was someone who said, you can also become a Christian on St. Thomas. And he insisted, no, I want to go to Denmark. So he had some sort of freedom, and that made us question his status as a slave
Right.
early on. Yeah.
He doesn't sound like a slave to me.
And we looked for, like for Diana, for his third wife, there are lists that list her as a freed woman in the 1750s. But we haven't found, these lists do not exist for the early years before he left for Copenhagen. We tried to find that. Yeah. Tom.
In the chat, we have a few questions, so I'll start here. Someone wrote that Anton Ulrich strikes them as something of an opportunist and therefore stood out from other enslaved peoples that are conclusions.
So the question is, Anton Ulrich stands out as an opportunist, and is he therefore different than other people?
Yeah,
I'm just repeating it for the people at home.
That one, I think. In the records of Anton Ulrich's 1841 return voyage to St. Thomas, would there have been any documentation for the arrival authorities that Anton Ulrich was free? Such proof would have been required for the Danish West Indian authorities. This is from Susan Lugo.
Mhm.
We haven't checked, or we haven't, I think I tried to sort of see if I could find something, but there, as far as I remember, there wasn't, but perhaps I didn't look hard enough. That would definitely be worth another look.
Yeah, the person who asked the question was archivist on St. Thomas for the government there. Yeah, so maybe they're on St. Thomas, these records.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were restricted to what was available online.
Yeah, I mean, the Danish, the National Archives in Denmark have digitized their entire West Indies collection. So there is quite a lot of stuff to find and go through. It's not organized super well, so it's also a bit of a challenge, but yeah.
We have some more questions in the chat. Do we have any information? Ulrika Wheathouse asks, do we have any information about Anton Ulrich's Moravian wife or wives? Any information about Anton Ulrich's Moravian wife?
Diana.
And Gracia.
Well, Gracia wasn't Moravian.
Well, she was not Moravian,
Yeah.
that's right. Yes.
So,
Yeah, Diana, we found her in the records, but then we found a baptism, but then there are two possible names, Maria and Amalia. It's possible that there's more biographical information for Maria and for Amalia. We didn't follow up on that.
no.
Well, thank you for answering that. Gavin Chase had a similar question also in the chat about third wife, and I think you addressed it there. Someone also asked, Sophia wrote, what religion were all of the count and countesses that served as Anton's godparents? And what religion was the church where he was baptized?
That was a Lutheran Danish state church, as far as I know, fairly certain. And I don't know about the church definitely, but I don't know about all the sponsors. But I am assuming, given the sort of religious climate of Denmark at the time, that everyone would have been Protestant. Lutheran evangelical Protestantism, which is a particular Danish brand.
I'm all confused about the slave and black, and first we were taught in the early days of the Moravians that Dober and Nitschmann sold themselves into slavery, and then we were later taught no, they couldn't do that because they were white. And now it feels like Anton was a freedman, and yet he held slaves when he went back. I'm kind of messed up. What were the norms at that time, as far as you could tell from what it just sort of seems appalling that he would become a slave master. and own a slave as a black man on St. Thomas.
But that was not unusual. I don't know how common it was, but it certainly happened more often. So there's a very famous example. Joseph Kusterbauer has done a lot of work on Mingo, who was a slave of Johann Carstens, who was a Creole slave, a plantation owner with Danish background and moved back to Denmark. He had an enslaved man called Mingo who himself owned slaves. And Mingo's wife, Joanna, who Joseph also has done a lot of work on, she also owned slaves. And she was a member of the Moravian community because there's some lists where it says that, you know, she's there with her slave and wants to recommend her slave woman for something or other. I can't remember, but so it certainly occurred. But I mean, I don't know whether it was sort of super common, but not unknown.
It's far more complex than we were than I was originally taught. Yeah.
So, and about the question if Leonhard, Dober and David Nitschmann sold themselves into slavery, apparently this was the original idea that Anton had suggested. Then in Copenhagen, when they arrived there, it turned out that people there were like, well, no, you cannot do that. And that's when the initial support that they had for this mission was also like, okay, we don't want to have anything to do with this. So that didn't materialize. That was not a plan that they followed. Scott.
So you guys found incredible material, some in Moravian archives, but also some in ships records, and he's such an important figure in the early Moravian church, like you laid out. Why do you feel like others haven't gone looking or haven't found this stuff?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it was, a lot of information is available in the Oldendorf book. And when that became available, people have picked up on that. Catherine Gerbner and Louise Sabro have written about that. And for us, really, we started because there's one of the letters to Anton by Zinzendorf is here in a scrapbook. And it's a very unusual that letter is here, and we talked about that, and Christina found more, and that's when we started. Why has not anyone else looked into this?
I think well, because sorry, was someone about to say something?
I was just going to say, you know, it's nice to ask a question like that, but what you're really asking is, at what point does a person become well known enough where things are taken off from that? Is at what point does that happen? I've encountered that kind of thing with architecture many times, and certain things are just ignored.
Yeah.
And they're just not picked up.
No.
And for whatever reason, people aggregate or are attracted to it, and other times they're not.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because I think for a very long time, what was there was enough.
Yeah.
What more do we need? Anton Ulrich started it all and woohoo, and see how it went, and then end of story. But at some point then, especially in the last, I don't know, 20, Oldendorf booking for this from 2000, that's 24 years ago. That's incredible. But so in the last 30, 40 years, there's been a much bigger focus on slavery and enslavement of people and so on. And I think that's where people then are not satisfied with that kind of question. But then the available material perhaps hasn't been there. And then the publication of Oldendorf's book then suddenly opened up for a lot of new information that's only just starting to take off. And if I could just say one more thing, the interesting thing about the Bossart edition is that because it leaves out all the later stuff, it actually sort of just confirms that Moravian story. He began it all and then went to Herrnhut, and that's it. And so even though that perhaps not was his intention, that's what happened all the same. And so it really did sort of open up with, when the sources are made more available, more things become possible.
Thing.
And also, he was such a disappointment to them overall, that they wanted this shining star.
Yeah.
And he couldn't be that for whatever reason. So then, of course, they couldn't really capitalize on him.
Yes.
Did you come across other names that you're maybe going to research? Names that haven't really been looked at?
Well, you found these other Black people who were in the Moravian Society in Copenhagen.
Yeah, the volunteer archivist in Christiansfeld, she found some catalogs from the society in Copenhagen from the 1760s and 70s, and found a number of.
Your next book.
You never know.
And the interesting thing is, we have looked at one person.
Yeah.
And then this may look at very unusual. And of course, this was very unusual, but the same year as Zinzendorf tried to get Anton Ulrich to become a missionary, another African man in Copenhagen encountered the Moravians in 1735. Christian Protten encountered the Moravians. He was willing to come to Herrnhut. He came to Herrnhut that same year, and he was made a missionary to Africa and in the Caribbean. So he did that, what Zinzendorf had in mind for Anton Ulrich. And in this issue of the Journal of Moravian History, the other article is about Christian Protten. So these two men are both in that particular issue. And when we look at this one baptism of Anton Ulrich in 1727, there were other baptisms of people from Africa going on in Copenhagen. It was not as unusual as it may look to me.
But even the fancy churches, so big sort of spectacle going on. So yeah, the Palace Church.
I don't know whether it's, I picked up on it, to an extreme way, but, it sounded like, Zinzendorf was really mad. But Anton was not God's will.
Yeah.
But to me, it was, you're not following what I want you to do.
Yes, because he'd written, I'm sure that a former table servant would be thrilled to become a servant of the Lamb, and well, no.
We have any additional time for questions from the chat?
Sure.
We're at past 5 already, so I just want to check it too. The Zoom is really, really active. There's probably 30 questions in there, so I think this is a really helpful question for sources from Kaila, right? Had a clarifying question. The scholarly edition, the commentary to the yellow volumes, are those available in English or just in German?
Unfortunately, just in German.
Yeah.
And what is available in English is the abridged version by Bossart, which is a bad rendition of Oldendorf's, unfortunately.
But what Bossart does have and Oldendorf does not is the years 61 and 62, and that is for some reason that's gone lost in Oldendorf's original manuscript, so they're not there, but they are included in Bossart's. So.
This was another question from Russ May. I recognize that this is about the history of Anton Ulrich's life, but do you see a glimpse of any peculiar missiology belonging to Anton within these writings, especially as a Black man communicating with Europeans about God?
Well, he had this interesting criticism of Europeans. He said Europeans teach one thing, but they live a different life. And that made the Europeans he encountered on St. Thomas incredible. And then he went to Copenhagen, learned about Christianity, but he seems to have had this criticism also towards the Moravians. One more question, and we can see what Kelly has put together in the back room.
Oh, do you want one more?
Tom?
Tom?
There's so many.
Okay.
Well, Paul D writes, could it be that Anton was dismayed over how he was regarded by the missionaries as a freed slave overseer against the enslaved, who it seemed were easier for the missionaries to relate? Thanks very much for this enlightening presentation. So I think it's essentially where the Moravian's perspective about Anton related to his work as a freed enslaved man, that he was dismayed over how he was regarded by the missionaries as a free enslaved man over against the enslaved, who it seemed were easier to relate to the missionaries. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, I didn't quite
I
get
don't quite
what the
understand.
question was, but I appreciate that people, and it invites to, you know, to think about what was going on and what, and we know so little about Anton
Yeah.
himself.
And so, you know, Paul's guess is as good as ours. And I mean, because we really don't know. We just sort of, you know, had a couple of thoughts based on what we presented, and there are many interpretations that are possible.
I think I can end with a comment, at least from Corporal Jarvis, Brigadier Bishop. I'm grateful for this enlightenment on Anton. I believe that he wanted to show that he was able to think for himself rather than being forced. Think for himself rather than being forced to do anything that Zinzendorf wanted him to do. Anton was a champion. He made his mistakes. Yeah.
All right.
Good, I think that's a very nice closing remark. Thank you, Cordroy, for that, and thank you for coming here today. Thank you for watching us online, and for you who are here, we have refreshments in the back gallery. Thank you, Christina, for listening.